Welcome to building a web app with ASP.NET Core, MVC, Entity Framework Core, Bootstrap, and Angular. In this course, I'm going to teach you how to build a web app using ASP.NET Core or ASP.NET in .NET 5. You're going to learn this by doing. Feel free to follow along the course. You can pause whenever you need and continue. And you'll see every line of code I write. The goal is for you to learn a number of skills that are all related to ASP.NET Core and MVC. These include HTML5, JavaScript, CSS, Bootstrap, data with Entity Framework Core, and client-side development with Angular. What I'm using for the course include Visual Studio 2019, though you could replace this with Visual Studio for Mac or even Visual Studio Code. We're going to be building it with ASP.NET Core 3.1 and or 5. Everything we're going to be doing works as well in both versions. Similarly, Entity Framework Core version 3 or version 5 can be used in this course. We'll use Bootstrap 4 and Angular 11. If you have questions during the course, the best way to reach me is to go to the discussion tab on the course itself. Questions asked there will be responded to as soon as I can get to them, often daily. But you can also search the discussion in case your question's already been answered. So why did Microsoft go through all the trouble to reinvent ASP.NET? It's been a viable platform for building web applications for quite a long time. It all starts with that the web stack itself has some rust in it. It's been around for many, many years. I think I first used it in 2001 or 2002. That makes it about 15 years old now. The age of the web stack has weighed down the ability of the team to make good improvements. The new ASP.NET is also trying to deal with certain problems that exist in ASP.NET, like machine-level upgrades of .NET. The idea of making a machine-level upgrade and having to re-verify against every application that may be on that machine causes many businesses to delay making upgrades to .NET, so that they don't have to re-verify certain of their applications. In many ways, ASP.NET had reached the ceiling of performance, where the team, because of the weight and the age of the stack, meant they really couldn't make improvements without tearing it all down and starting from scratch. When we think about ASP.NET Core, we have to remember that this is a complete rethinking of the entire platform. Not just the web components, but .NET itself. So let's look and see what ASP.NET Core actually is. So what exactly is ASP.NET Core? It's a complete rewrite of the platform. It is meant to be cross-platform and open source. It has combined the platforms of MVC and Web API to a single code base, and it has created the new framework where everything is a dependency. It's jettisoned some of the weight and the age of the code base, allowing them to get to a very small memory footprint. It's allowing multiple deployment support, which means it can be deployed in the cloud and IaaS through self-hosting and other scenarios. So let's try to look at the big picture. Right now, inside of the world of the web, we really have two scenarios. We have Windows, and then we have Unix, Linux, OS X as platforms. And very much ASP.NET has been a Windows-only solution. So when we look at ASP.NET Core, including some of the subsystems shown here, it really crosses both the Unix and Linux-based operating systems as well as continuing to support Windows. So ASP.NET Core can sit on top of .NET 4.6, which represents the existing .NET CLR. But it also can sit on top of .NET Core, which is a new cross-platform version of the CLR, often called Core CLR versus the .NET CLR. This means that ASP.NET Core can still sit on top of IIS as a native loader, or it can sit on top of Windows using self-hosted execution, and then over on Unix, Linux, and OS X, it can also be executed via self-hosted execution. So this enables ASP.NET to be used in more scenarios than it ever could. It can be developed off of Windows if you wanted to. It can be deployed off of Windows if you wanted to. And this enables a lot of scenarios that were just too difficult to get into prior to ASP.NET Core. Now in this course, we're going to focus on using a Windows IDE, chiefly Visual Studio 2017, to build the applications. But I will show you in the last module how to deploy it on non-Microsoft operating systems. This newer version of ASP.NET Core, or MVC, can run on several frameworks. We have the .NET 4X version, and this is the .NET version you've known for a long time, or you may have certainly heard of the last 15 or 20 years. And it's typically limited to Windows only. Microsoft introduced .NET Core as a way to get around that limitation. It's a cross-platform version of the .NET framework as well as the CLR, the common language runtime that it actually uses. And it's supported on Linux, Mac, and Windows. Recently, the introduction of what's been called .NET 5, and this is a single .NET. This is one that works both on Windows, Mac, and Linux, but includes the breadth of support that .NET 4 does. And so that means supporting not only ASP.NET, but also things like WinForms, WPF, etc. This one umbrella that all .NET, wherever you're going to write C# or VB.NET, is supported. Again, like .NET Core, it's cross-platform, but this really is the merging of these two platforms together. It is the future of where .NET is going. But you do want to think about which versions to use based on the support they're going to get. In .NET Core 3 and 3.1, they had this notion of .NET Core 3 had general availability, which you were allowed to use it pretty much anywhere you wanted to, but it wasn't going to be maintained with bug and security fixes long term. It was basically a bridge to .NET Core 3.1, which has long-term support. So when you think about the way Microsoft is going to support a platform for a longer term, 3, 5, sometimes even 10 years. This is going to be similar in the .NET 5 and .NET 6 space. .NET 5 is, again, one of these general availabilities. So if you're building brand new products today, you may decide to stick with .NET Core 3.1 because of its long-term support until you decide whether to migrate to .NET 5. Alternatively, you can decide to adopt .NET 5 so you're on the newer platform and know that you're going to migrate to .NET 6 when that time comes. It's important to note that everything I'm teaching in this course as it relates to .NET Core is pretty much the same between .NET Core 3.1 and .NET Core 5. The difference between these platforms is really affected only for things outside of ASP.NET. So the support for Blazor, the support for WPF, WinForms, Xamarin, etc. ASP.NET Core is also fully composed. What that means is that everything above the CLR and some of the loading mechanism is just a package. It's just a package that we get from NuGet. The framework simply has a way to launch and pull the .NET Core framework simply as a way to load the CLR and start execution of code. And that's about it. Everything else we're going to be using, MVC, logging, identity, etc., they're all just NuGet packages. What that means is that everything is optional. If you want to replace the built-in identity stuff with your own identity, you don't have to include both of them and turn one off. If you don't want to use MVC and you want to do something raw or go to a third party or another open source solution, feel free to do that. That means you can still sit on top of .NET Core whether you're using MVC or not. Microsoft has really made the decision to embrace the open web. So it wants to use existing and new web development tooling wherever possible. This means using Node Package Manager for tooling support, using an NPM, Yarn, or other client-side package managers for client-side libraries, Gulp for build automation, NuGet for .NET packages, and none of this is required. You can figure out how you want to use the existing web ecosystem that works for a variety of different solutions out there. Microsoft doesn't care what you bring to ASP.NET, especially for client-side development, where the space is moving so fast, it doesn't want to reinvent any of that. When we're thinking about deployment options on ASP.NET Core, we can see that we have different options for different operating systems. Now on Windows, we can deploy it directly on hardware we own, in a VM, in a container, or in a variety of cloud hostings. On Mac, we're pretty much limited to directly on hardware, though we can do some container support while in development. And on Linux, we also have the full breadth of support directly on hardware, in virtual machines, in containers, and of course cloud hosting on Linux. The only caveat here is that each version of ASP.NET Core has a fixed number of distributions that it's going to support. I think it's about 10 distributions as of ASP.NET Core 2. Some of those Linux distributions are now preloading ASP.NET Core as part of their distributions. So you can see a partnership between Microsoft and the Linux world being deeper than it has been at any point in my career. So now let's see how to install the latest version of ASP.NET Core. So to get the SDK installed, let's start by going to .net, or .net if you prefer. We can see it's getting started on just this page, telling you a bit about where .NET is supported. We're going to go to the download link right here. And this is going to give us a couple of different options. We have .NET Framework 4.8, and that's for desktop development or Windows-only development. Here's the 3.1 version, and you'll notice it shows that it has long-term support. And then if you want to stay on .NET or .NET Core for longer, this is a good solution. Otherwise, you can go ahead and download the .NET version here. You're going to want to download the SDK, not the runtime, but actually the SDK. You'll see it the same for each of these. It has guessed what version of the SDK I'm using because of my operating system. I'm using 64-bit Windows. And so if we come over here to .NET 5, it'll go ahead and open that up. Well, let's go ahead and just save that for a minute. And notice that it's saying if you're using Visual Studio. I'll show you how to install Visual Studio in just a minute. But let's install that SDK by just clicking on it. And you can see whichever version of the SDK you're using, you'll see the different versions here. And we'll go ahead and start the install process. It should be pretty quick because the actual code that it's installing is a pretty small piece. It's just the command line tools as well as the compiler tools. I like to do this to know what versions of the SDK I'm going to be using. Later when we install Visual Studio, it will already install a version of the SDK for you as well. But I'd like you to know about this so that you get the latest version of the SDK to work with. Again, you may decide for this course that you already are using .NET 3.1 or 3.0 and want to stick with that, or install the latest version of the SDK if you're new to .NET. You can see it's going to give you a brief summary. Go ahead and just say close. I'm going to open up a console window. I'm using Windows Terminal, though it really doesn't matter which console you're using, Command Shell, PowerShell, it doesn't really matter. And I'll just open up my examples folder that I'm going to be using. And I'm just going to say .NET. And by typing .NET, this is the command tool that the SDK uses. You're going to see it gives you a list of options here. And typically, there's going to be .NET and then some command within .NET that you're going to run. A couple things to note here is it's going to be able to show you the runtimes and the SDKs that are installed. Because I have had several versions of Visual Studio and .NET running, if I do this with list SDKs, you'll actually see I have several versions. I have a 3.1, a couple versions of 5.01, and actually a preview version of 5.02 because I've installed a preview version of Visual Studio. If we do .NET version, it'll show that we're using that same version we just installed, the 103. We'll be using the 103 for our examples. Now let's create our Hello World app, the first, simplest version of a .NET Core application that we can, without even using Visual Studio. Back at a command prompt, one of the things we're going to see in the list of options is new, and this is you can create .NET projects or files directly using the CLI tool. Again, this isn't something you're going to do every day, but I want you to really understand all of what's happening underneath the covers, how the IDE is helping you. In addition, if you're using a tool like Visual Studio Code or other just text editor, knowing that you can use these commands without having to have the weight of an IDE, if that's the way you prefer to work, I want you to know that it's capable of doing that. So we're going to start with .NET New, and I'm going to do help after this command as well so we can see what options are there. And it's gone off the screen, but what we can see here is quite a lot of projects in .NET Core 3.0. The only one we're really going to care about so far is console. Later on, we might use a web app or an Angular app, etc. But we're going to start with just that console app. So the way we can do this is I'm going to make a folder called Hello World, because why wouldn't you call it that? And I'm just going to say .NET New Console. If we look at this new folder, we can see that it contains a project file and a CS file. And if we want to get all of the dependencies, because the CS file will actually contain any dependencies we might need, we can use the .NET command to just say restore. This will go and look in that and get all of the required dependencies from NuGet for us. If we say .NET Build, it'll actually go ahead and build a version of our project. And finally, we can do .NET Run to actually execute the project. If build hadn't been done already, it would also build it in the background. And so we can see that all it's doing is literally saying hello world. Let's look at the files individually. I'm going to use Notepad to do this, and I'm just going to say program.cs. And so all it's doing is it's a simple console app that just writes out hello world, right? Let's do the same thing with Notepad, hello-world.cs proj. By the way, the reason the name that the project file is called Hello World, because that was the name of the folder that it's in. You can override and do anything you want there, but by default, it tries to be nice and simple. In this case, it's just an XML file that contains a couple of things. It contains what version of the framework we're going after, and what kind of output. And in this case, we're saying we want an executable we can actually run. So in our code here, let's actually just write a tiny bit of code. Instead of saying hello world, let's also just write out to the console something else. Let's say we want to serialize our object using something like JSON convert, which is part of the JSON.NET project. And let's just serialize those arguments into JSON and spit them out in the field. Of course, this JSON convert, it doesn't know where this is coming from, so we'll probably need a using statement up here, and it's from a project called newtonsoft.json, right? So this should compile for us. Let's see what happens. I've saved the file. We go back to the command prompt and .NET add package, because we want to get it from NuGet. We want to add newtonsoft. I happen to know the name of the package is newtonsoft.json. And unless you specify a version, it'll get the latest version. And what's happened here is if we open up that project file, it's actually added it to the XML in something called a package reference. You can type these manually, or you could use the tool or the CLI to add these for you, but this has added the NuGet package for us in a pretty simple way. Now that if we say .NET Build, we're going to still get the Newtonsoft because I've, of course, misnamed it. So if we go back over to the program.cs, let's just make sure that Newtonsoft is all lowercase. And I've also made another mistake here, and this should be serialize object, not just serialize. With that change, I could go ahead and build this again. It'll build successfully, and of course if I run .NET Run, it'll show it, and the JSON version is just an empty array. But if I go ahead and add parameters like this is a plural site course, it'll take each of those arguments afterwards and just create an array of them, which of course is the JSON version of that. And so we can see this very simple, admittedly contrived, stupid example will allow us to do a lot of building directly using the console and just something like Notepad. But of course, that's not what we're going to really use. We're going to use Visual Studio to go ahead and start building our application. Let's do that next. So now let's see how to install Visual Studio 2019. So if we just go to visualstudio.net, it'll take us to the home of Visual Studio, and we'll want to go to the download section, and you'll see the 3 versions of Visual Studio 2019. This is also where you can get Visual Studio Code if you'd prefer to work with that. Again, that's not exactly how we're going to work with it. And using the community version is plenty fine. By using the Community Edition, it will have everything we need to build the entire course. Professional and Enterprise include some other features that you may want to consider, but as far as getting through this course, the free Community Edition is all you need. So you click to download it, it'll download a really small version. And then once you run that new file, you want to say OK in the Visual Studio installer. And this might take a little while to go ahead and download the entire version. And this is actually installing the Visual Studio installer, not just Visual Studio itself. You can see I already have both a preview version and the full version installed here. And there's even an update for the regular 2019. I'm using the preview version because that's the one that's compatible with .NET Core 3 right now. You will more than likely just need this version by the time you watch this course. If you pick install, which I won't because I already have it installed, I just want to show you the couple of things that you really have to have included. So you want the ASP.NET and web development. This will include everything for ASP.NET Core. You want that checked. Optionally, you can include the Windows development. I've included it, but it's not necessary for the course. But on the bottom, you want to make sure it says .NET Core cross-platform development is also checked. So you don't need every workload from the install, but those two are the ones that are pretty critically important. Is the web development tooling, and then the cross-platform development, which will make sure that all of ASP.NET Core and .NET Core are installed for you. I didn't make any changes, so I'm going to close it, but at that point you would run it and you'd have Visual Studio. And if you run Visual Studio, and we're going to be using the preview version for a lot of the code here, it will normally open up to a welcome page. You can just close that, because what we're going to want to do is create a new project, Control-Shift-N if you're on a PC, and it should be similar on a Mac. And if we see a whole list of applications here, you won't have the recent templates, so I just really want to show you where these are. One of them is going to be an ASP.NET Core web application. This will be the kind of applications we're going to be building, and this will allow you to create a number of different types. This will actually take you to a second page where you actually pick what flavor of ASP.NET Core to use. Here I'll just name it Big Project, and I'll put it in our examples folder. And I'm not going to create a special directory for it. I'm going to put it all in one folder. After we say create here, this is where that extra dialog will appear for the flavor of an ASP.NET Core application. And so you can see there's an empty version, an API version that will just create a project for creating APIs, but without web pages of any sort. Web applications, and this will allow you to create fairly simple web applications using what's called Razor Pages, which we will cover in this course. Web application with Model View Controller, and that's where we'll spend most of our time. And then there are some templates for some client-side libraries, Angular, React, and then React with Redux. And these are essentially this project type with some special tooling for these type of projects. We're not going to use these to actually create the Angular app later on in the course. We'll actually add it in so you can see what all the moving pieces are. And for me, I'm just going to create a Model View Controller version. I'm not going to enable Docker support, but if you want to see what these are like in a Docker container, that's not a bad solution. I also want to turn on authentication here to just individual projects. And this is more typical of enterprise sort of applications where you want to be able to store individual accounts in some sort of data store. And if we press OK on that, it'll go ahead and create it. And this could be where we get started. This has created a fairly complex application. It has special areas for identity. It has controllers for getting at individual pages. It has a lib folder here that includes some very initial versions of jQuery and Bootstrap that it uses for its template, data structures for storing data in a database, models for showing stuff on error pages, and even a bunch of views here for individual pages, right? There's a lot going on here. And if I were to teach you how to build an ASP.NET Core application by digging in each one of these, and I could show you the code that's generated, that would be awesome, right? Except it'd be confusing, and there's so much boilerplate here that I want you to understand where all the pieces work. And so instead of that, we're going to actually start from a pretty empty project. Let's do that next so we can see where we're actually starting. So now let's create the starting project for what we're going to actually build over the course of however many hours this course is. Back in Visual Studio, I'm going to start in the same place, and I'm going to say New Project. And I'm going to pick ASP.NET Core web application again, just like we did before. But this time I'm going to call it Dutch Treat, which is going to be the name of our web project we're going to build. And instead of being in this location, let's just put it in Examples. This will actually be an example that you'll be able to download. We are going to create a new solution, and I'm going to put it in the same directory, just like we did before. But instead of the web application or web application with model view controllers, we're going to actually start with the empty project. We go ahead and pick empty project and say create. Notice there's no authentication turned on. In fact, I'm going to even turn off HTTPS because we're going to show you how that's configured later. I'm just going to press create. And so this really creates a project with just a couple of files. There's a startup, there's a program, and then there's a settings file that will actually end up changing later. But that's just a piece of JSON for any settings that your project might have. But we're going to ignore that for a minute and focus on program.cs. If you remember when we created the new console Hello World app a minute ago, it also had a program.cs. And that's because if we open this, we'll see that this program.cs actually has a void main. What I mean is that essentially your ASP.NET project is a console app that happens to be listening for web requests. This is very different from what you might have been used to if you're coming from ASP.NET, where it was this magical thing that we sort of threw an IIS and it worked. But in this case, this application will run just at a console or inside of a Docker container or on a Linux box. All it is just an executable that we can call. So if we go ahead and build this, I'm not going to make any changes yet. I'm not going to start tearing this apart to see what it is. We can see that if we were to debug it, we actually have a couple of options. We have IIS or using Dutch Treat, which is just the executable. But I'm going to go ahead and open up a console window. You may or may not have this add-in in Visual Studio. If you don't, you'll want to go get the add-in. Open command line is what it's called. And this will just allow you to open a shell right in the project. We look at the project just like it was before. We still have a CS proj here, so we should be able to just say .NET run. And that's effectively running just the application as a console app. And so we can see here now it's running it and it's just listening on a port, right? Just listening by default on port 5000. If we come back over to a browser and we say HTTP localhost 5000, what comes up? Hello world, right? Let's close that for the minute, and I'm going to stop this so it's not listening anymore, and we'll talk a little bit about what you're seeing on the screen a little later. Don't worry about it too much right now. But we can get that same behavior by clicking Dutch Treat, and if we run it with or without debugging, then we're going to get that same experience. It's going to open up the console window for us, and it's going to launch a browser for us at whatever the port is. Some people, instead of worrying about how it's running, would prefer to just use IIS Express, just so it runs in a little bit more familiar way. And then if we run it, we're just going to get the browser window, right? Has some random port number on the back, so that's a change between them. But you also have a window in the output called Web Server, right? ASP.NET Core Web Server. And this will give you that same diagnostics we were seeing on the screen earlier. So remember that's there. Every time you make a change, you'll simply be able to refresh the main page. And you'll see me do that quite a lot. Now that we know kind of how to run it, let's do a couple of things to get our project ready for the work we want to do. First thing I'm going to do is look at the properties of the project. Because if we're going to run in IIS, which is the way I'm going to do it for the most part in our project, this port number is going to make me crazy. So I'm just going to give it 8888. So you'll see that familiar number over and over and over again as the port number. And the rest of this you can leave the same. Go ahead and close that. And in our startup, we're going to actually take this empty project, which is a little more full than you might imagine for an empty project, and we're going to leave this for the most part. This is basically saying when this console app is run, I want you to create a host, build that host, and then run that host. And what this create host builder is actually just calling a static function on our program class that we're saying create a default builder, configure a web host, because there are going to be different kind of hosts that ASP.NET Core supports, and we want a web host in this case. And we're just going to say, hey, for the startup object, for knowing how to configure this thing, just use a class called startup. And that, unsurprisingly, is where the startup.cs comes in. This is boilerplate. You're rarely going to change. We're actually going to change some things in it later on in the course, but this will never be a big piece of code that you're going to need to maintain or worry about. But I'd like you to know exactly where that first line of code is executed, and it's simply exactly right here, right? This is the first thing it actually does. And so you can see all the moving pieces. And this is a change in .NET Core that if you're coming from normal .NET or from another platform, it should be more comforting. Like there's more things that are obviously being done instead of it all being hidden under the covers that later on, if you have a problem, you'll have to figure out how to debug. In this case, it's all at your fingertips, so you know that, oh, I wonder if the app is even running. Okay, let's set a breakpoint inside main. Oh, okay, it is being run, so at least we're getting that far, and then go this far, and then go this far. So I quite like that about .NET Core versus, working in the .NET framework for the last 15 plus years. Let's look at the other class, Startup, just to talk about what this does. And we're going to explain what configure service is and what configure does. But in the big picture, I want you to just get a sense of this is how you configure to start listening for requests. I'm going to actually change this a little. I'm going to get rid of this code that just says is development and developer exception page. We'll come back and actually rewrite that later so you can see what's going on. You can see even an empty project. I want to really get down to the bare bones. And so we're going to use something called routing. And this is basically opting into the feature of routing. And routing simply says, I'm going to figure out what code to run based on what is in the URL for my website. And this essentially says, if someone goes to the root of the website, run this line of code, right? And what I'm doing with this line of code is saying, write out to the response, hello world. Let's run this for a second so we can explain what's going on. So in this hello world, if we use the browser tools, just F12, I'm using Firefox. It's going to be very similar in Chrome or Edge if you're using the new Edge. And I'm just going to look at the network tab and refresh. And you'll see that it's gone ahead and requested a file at the root of our web server. And what happens for the response is all we got was hello world. We got a raw text of hello world. It wasn't magically wrapped in an HTML document. It wasn't trying to guess what you wanted. It literally did exactly what you want. And so there's less things to confuse you in this case, right? It also did a request to a favicon, which of course we don't have, and so it returned a 404. But that's really the browser going, oh, I went to a new website, let me see if they have an icon. That's nothing really about what we're doing. So let's break this down even further, right? Later on, we're going to understand how routing and how endpoints are related to all this. But we're going to get rid of that for now, right? Let's go ahead and just get down to just this simple of a web server as you can have. And we can do that by just saying app, which is this application builder, and we can say run. And every time we're run this line of code, right? Anytime a request comes in, run this line of code. That's all we're saying here. And so configure is what to do when a web request comes in. That's really all this is saying. We run this, we're getting that same behavior, but now it doesn't even care about the route. So if I do foo bar, it's still going to say hello world, because I'm literally saying in the code, all I want you to do when you run is return this. So this is a very primitive way to think about what code is really running, and you'll really never work with it at this point. But we certainly could make this an HTML document, right? We can just say HTML, body, h1, hello world. We now have a well-formed HTML website that does exactly what we want, right? We'll run it again. Ooh, now it's an H1, right? We're building a real web server, but you probably don't want to actually do that, right? That doesn't seem like a very crafty idea to actually look at and craft your HTML from the beginning. So we're going to want some helpers. What's different here from what you may have used in prior versions is that by default, the simplest thing allows you to get at the bare metal if you need to. And then you can decide whether it's Microsoft's version or some other third-party or open source solution that helps you build the best type of application. Through this course, I'm going to use most of Microsoft's conventions here, but I want you to really see that it's not trying to hide anything anymore. There's not any magic pipeline that's happening behind the scenes that you have to go look up to see what's being called when. This is really the actual code that's being executed. Next, let's see how to serve actual files. You'll, of course, not want to build your applications like this. You're going to want to build them through templates and files and JavaScript and CSS and all of that, right? And so let's start that process next. So let's go ahead and create our first file to serve. So back here in Visual Studio, we don't want to actually have this run. We want to do something different. We want to actually have an HTML page that we serve from the web browser. So let's go to Dutch Treat and just add a new empty file. Now I have an extension called New File that allows me to add these very quickly with Shift F2, and I suggest you include it because you're going to see me use it a lot in this course. All you do is in a directory, whether that's at the root or an actual directory, it just hit Shift F2, and I can go ahead and say index.html, and it'll generate it for me. Makes it much quicker to create files for me. And so here I'll do h1, and I'll just put the project name. Again, this is a pure HTML file. We'll get to looking at MVC and Razor pages later on in the course, but let's do things as simply as we can. So there's our project. And if you're used to ASP.NET before now, with that file in there, we should be able to just go over to the browser and just type index.html. And you're shown nothing. So what's going on here? Let's look at our browser tools, F12. And let's just refresh this real quick. Let's go to the console. And we'll see that the get for that actually did a 404 or file not found. So our web server isn't finding our flat file, but let's talk about something more interesting. A 404 didn't display any error page. That's because we're building up from scratch in ASP.NET, and 404 or exceptions or 500 errors, none of those are going to show anything to the user by default. So you don't any longer have to deal with trying to disable the yellow screen of death, as we used to call it in ASP.NET, or anything. You can decide what that actually shows. But we'll show you that as we get into MVC a little later. But let's try to figure out why this is actually returning a 404. If we come over here to Dutch treat, we'll see that it exists and we spelled it right and all that. But by default, ASP.NET doesn't serve files. So let's open up our startup and let's look at in the configure. I'd like to be able to actually serve files. And you might think at bare minimum, a web server should serve files. But in fact, there's a bunch of different project types where you don't want to have to serve files. Or it's even against the security protocol for the websites. This happens a lot in government projects in the United States. So if we come here, we want to tell it that we want to configure our web server to do something. Instead of just have that answer every call, we want it to do something. So we're going to say app.use static files. And what this is saying is when the web server comes up, we're going to tell it to add the service of serving static files as something that it can do. So by adding static files, we should be able to come back, refresh, and it should work, but it still doesn't. The reason it doesn't is because static files will serve files, but the default behavior here for static files is to only deliver files that are inside of this magic www root directory. So let me move it there. We can see it's now nested in there, and let's see if it now works. It does. And we know it's the file because we set the title that we can see here, as well as that H1 that we're seeing here as the header. So why the www root? Most other web frameworks have had this idea of a safe place to deliver files from. Microsoft had taken a different approach and basically said, you can serve files anywhere, but only these curated set of files. And if you need more, then you'll need to configure that different kinds of files are supported. This hit most developers when they started needing to deliver things like font files or PDFs or other sorts of files that maybe were new on the scene and needed to handle it. So if you started to deal with like delivering font files, that actually meant you needed added a number of these things called MIME types as supported file types. The philosophy everyone else took and that Microsoft has finally embraced is that as long as you put it in www root, we'll just serve it. We assume that you're going to put only safe files in there, and then we don't have to worry about you accidentally serving a configuration file or program.cs or something else that might contain secure information. So the way it's handled is that the www root is treated like the root of the web server. That's why this index.html doesn't have the phrase www root anywhere in it. It's treated directly as the root of the web server. And we can have directories in here as well. So if we created a CSS directory and moved this there, temporarily of course, since it's a CSS directory, this would fail because it can't find that path But if we added the CSS before, it would of course find it. And so let's move it back to the root. So you can have structure there. It's just treated for static files, for flat files, the root of the web server or the application if you're hosting it in IIS. But what if we want the behavior of finding that index.html by default? So here in the web server, we might be used to default files and be able to just say, look at the root server, and if an index or default.html or .aspx from back in the days exists, serve that instead. That's something else we can opt into. So if we go app, use default files, which if you're not serving HTML directly, you may not be interested in, but we're going to want to use this for our next module, so let's go ahead and add it. And if we refresh now, index.html is one of the types of files that are in the default files, and you can, of course, customize it as well. And so it shows it. But it also allows us to look and see what startup.cs is actually doing. What if we were to change the order of these? Instinctually, would you think that changing the order would matter? Let's refresh it and see if it does. No longer finds it. Why is it not finding it? In configure, you're actually setting up the order of what middleware runs. Middleware is a $20 word for a 5-cent idea. So when I talk about middleware, what I'm really talking about is saying, when a request comes in, I want you to run some code for me. And the important part is that the order here matters. If you think about in most systems, the order of what is handled in the request, the order really matters. You want to see if the user's logged in before you try to figure out whether to render a page, and maybe you're doing logging after that. The order of how that request is handled, what they used to call the ASP.NET pipeline, is important. And the ASP.NET pipeline used to be this thing that was under the covers in the plumbing that you had to sort of learn as you developed ASP.NET applications. And for us, this is the entire pipeline. Let me talk about what this actually does. So the use default files middleware, all it does is look for a blank directory URL. So at the root of the web server or at the root of a folder, if the URL looks like that, it's going to search in that structure, like in the www root. If we execute just our localhost 8888 port, it's going to look in the file system to see whether there's an index.html or a default.html or an index.htm, or I think there's a couple other files it also looks for to deliver by default. But it doesn't deliver them. All it does is changes the internal path to that file. And then the request goes from here and gets passed to the next piece of middleware, uStaticFiles, and uStaticFiles says, oh, that's now an URL that I know how to serve, because internally I see that it has the index.html attached to it, and I know how to serve that static file. So when we reverse this order, what happens is uStaticFiles looks for the empty URL, doesn't find anything that can serve it, and then default files changes the URL, but there's no one to listen for it anymore, right? There's no one that cares after it. These pieces of middleware are linked to each other, where all they know is that once they're done with their work, they need to call the next piece of middleware. So there's no tight coupling between them, but it also allows that stack, that order of these pieces of middleware to be important and to allow you as a developer to see everything that's happening in that stack, because it's here in configure. It's here in configure in the right order. That's an important concept in ASP.NET Core, and I want you to really understand that the order of these matter. And as we continue to build out our application, you're going to see us add middleware in certain orders on purpose. So let's wrap up this module. So what have we learned? I introduced you to a whole new world of .NET that's out there right now, and how important it is for you to pick the right version of .NET and to see forward what Microsoft has in store. I've shown you how to use both the IDE or the command line. Even though we're going to be using the IDE for the most part, being able to drop down onto the command line for certain commands can be really helpful. We will be using this, especially in Entity Framework, to do some of our work. And hopefully I've convinced you about the fact that Microsoft has open sourced all of this, that really .NET Core and ASP.NET Core specifically has been open source top to bottom, that integrating with the open source movement as well as open source libraries in general is going to be the way forward for .NET and the entire community. Next up, we're going to start to look at the basics of HTML and CSS.